It was one of those Oxford mornings when the air itself seemed reluctant to begin again. Mist folded over the rooftops, bells arguing faintly across the spires, the cobbles slick with last night's indecision. I'd taken a table by the window in a small cafe on Broad Street, a newspaper spread open before me like a confession I had no wish to read. My coffee had gone cold. The crossword was halfway done, an unremarkable one, though there was a clue about loss I could not answer. Loss has always been a slippery concept in Oxford here. It tends to masquerade as scholarship. It was the obituary that caught me. Printed without ceremony, in the third column, Dr. Stephen Collingwood was found dead at his desk, late of St. Jude's College. I stared at that phrase, late or longer than necessary. A small, fussy preposition, too polite to say what it meant. People die every term in Oxford, professors, porters, even students who mistime the balance between brilliance and despair. But something in that phrasing, the restraint of it, unsettled me. Lewis arrived 20 minutes later, rain on his shoulders, his good nature largely intact. He said he'd tried calling earlier, and I told him I'd switched the phone off. I rarely answer it before noon. He looked at the paper, then at me, and said that perhaps we should let the man rest. I told him that was precisely what he seemed to have done permanently. Lewis has learned over the years that my interest in death is not confined to my profession. He didn't argue further. The waitress brought a fresh pot of coffee without being asked. I suspect she decided I looked like the sort of man who lingered over unspoken things. Across the street, a group of undergraduates were rushing toward a lecture, their gowns flaring behind them like crows startled from a field. October light has a peculiar sadness to it. It flatters nothing and reveals everything. I folded the newspaper, paid, and told Lewis we'd take the long way to St. Jude's. The college gates were still wet when we arrived. St. Jude's, for all its history, remains one of those Oxford enclaves that prefers obscurity to prestige. The porter's lodge smelled of varnish and quiet disapproval. Lewis asked after Dr. Collingwood's rooms, and the porter, a man with the cautious eyes of someone long accustomed to listening, said the late Don had been found early that morning by the cleaner, slumped at his desk, a glass of wine broken near his hand. The doctor had been working on something about Ovid, the porter thought. Exile, maybe. I remember thinking that every Oxford academic was in exile of one sort or another. We were led through the quadrangle, past lawns still beaded with rain, into a narrow staircase that smelled of dust and resignation. The room itself was meticulously ordered. A desk, a typewriter, a stack of papers clipped neatly, and, on the top, an open book of Horace. I moved closer. Odes 2. A faint underline beneath dulce et decorum est. I felt the corners of my mouth twitch, the old irony of noble death, quoted too often by those who never saw it. But here it seemed neither noble nor intentional, only deliberate in its tidiness. Lewis examined the window. Locked. The door had been forced by the porter when the key failed to answer. On the wall hung a faded photograph of a summer garden party, perhaps 10 years earlier, all pale linen and polite ambition. Collingwood stood near the center, a man in late middle age with the sort of distracted intelligence that mistakes thought for distance. A woman beside him smiled without conviction. I turned the frame over. A date and nothing else. There are times when I sense the beginnings of a case not through evidence but through atmosphere. Something invisible begins to align, the air rearranges itself, as though aware of its coming purpose. Standing in that narrow room, I felt it again, the faint pulse beneath the stillness, the wrongness that hides within the ordinary. Lewis asked whether I thought it was suicide. I said nothing. He suggested natural causes. I said nothing again. I could feel the porter watching from the doorway, uneasy with our silence. In Oxford, silence has always been more eloquent than speculation. Before leaving, I noticed a small scrap of paper caught between two books on the shelf. It was the edge of a letter, torn. Only 3 visible Michaelmas, begin again. I slipped it into my pocket. Outside, the bells of All Saints began their quarter-hour lament. The sound drifted down the narrow street like memory refusing to fade. I told Lewis we'd stop by the Bodleian. Later, I wanted to check something about the word decorum. He gave me a puzzled look, but didn't ask why. He knows better now. The afternoon deepened, the mist gathering once more along the river. I thought about Collingwood, a man who'd chosen the wrong term to die in. Michaelmas has always seemed to me a season for beginnings, not endings. And yet, as we walked toward the car, I found myself repeating the words of St. Jude's under my breath, as though the repetition might reveal their hidden grammar. Some phrases, like some deaths, never quite explain themselves. The porter had warned us the room was unpleasant, though he'd meant the air rather than the memory. There's a difference, but only a subtle one. Oxford stone keeps secrets longer than people do, and Collingwood's room still seemed to be listening. Lewis went first, his shoes too practical for the staircase, which complained under his weight. I followed more slowly. My hangover had receded into that tolerable ache that sharpens rather than dulls perception. It was late morning, and the corridor outside the late fellow's study smelled faintly of polish and the kind of books no one had touched since the war. Inside, the dust had not yet settled. The light through the casement was unkind, showing the dust in motion, like thoughts too restless to die. The desk bore the usual domestic paraphernalia of scholarship papers in neat piles, the fossilized crust of candle wax, a silver letter opener shaped like a dagger. The wine glass on the floor had left a stain on the carpet, dark and circular, almost ceremonious. Lewis crouched beside it, muttering something about carelessness. I told him that carelessness was rarely fatal in Oxford, though it often led to tenure. He didn't smile. He lifted a fragment of glass with his pencil. Sticky. Red wine, or so it pretended to be. The medical report had been brief cardiac arrest, possibly stress-induced, no sign of foul play. But as I looked around, I felt that peculiar tension between order and deceit, the same dissonance I used to find in a student essay, written too well for its author. There was an open book on the desk, Horace again, Odes the Second, and a note in the margin in a different hand. 3 words, written lightly in pencil: "We are exiles." I don't believe in coincidence when it comes to poetry. Collingwood had been preparing a lecture on Ovid's Tristia, that long lament for a man banished from Rome. Perhaps exile had seemed a suitable topic for a man exiled from his own life. Lewis opened the cabinet and found a neat row of medicine bottles. Heart tablets. I took one, read the label, and replaced it. Digitalis. Prescribed dosage 1 tablet at night. I asked how many were left. Lewis counted. 2 missing. The clock on the mantel ticked with ecclesiastical disapproval. It was wounded, I noticed, though the man who wounded it was dead. That, too, bothered me. The recently dead rarely think to tend their clocks. I sat at the desk, studying the arrangement. A page of lecture notes, half-typed, the ribbon already fading. The title at the top read, Exile as Elegy the Scholar's Solitude. Beneath, a line that had stopped mid-sentence. In the end, all banishment is self-imposed. Nothing followed. The dash hung like an unanswered question. Lewis asked whether I thought it was suicide. I said I thought he was too tidy a man for that. He said perhaps the heart had simply stopped, tired of keeping time. I asked whether he noticed anything missing. He looked around the books, the papers, the neatly folded scarf on the chair. Nothing obvious. But I'd seen the faint square of dust on the shelf, the mark of something recently removed. A book, perhaps, or a box, something that belonged there and didn't now. The porter waited outside in the corridor, cap in hand, a ritual of guilt. He said Collingwood had been in good spirits the previous evening, preparing for term as usual. He dined in the hall, had a glass or two of wine, and left early. No visitors, as far as anyone knew, except perhaps Miss Dane. The way he said her name told me she'd been discussed more often than invited. Lewis jotted her address from the college file, and I asked one final question. Had the study been locked? The porter nodded. Locked from the inside. They'd broken the door in the morning when the scout couldn't rouse him. The window was latched, too. A sealed room, then. I dislike sealed rooms. They have a way of making death look too neat, too editorial. Outside, the quad was drenched in cold sunlight. A line of undergraduates crossed toward the chapel, their laughter brief and uncertain. I told Lewis we'd visit the widow next. He asked whether I thought she'd know anything useful. I said she'd know something true, which wasn't quite the same thing. As we walked back to the car, the bell in the college tower began to strike at noon. I paused to listen. 12 slow notes, the same tone repeating until meaning dissolved into rhythm. The porter's words lingered behind them, locked from the inside. It was the kind of phrase meant to reassure. Yet the longer I turned it over in my mind, the more it felt like a clue rather than a fact. A locked door, after all, can just as easily be locked by the one who leaves. It was raining again when we reached Woodstock Road, the kind of rain Oxford keeps for itself, fine and deliberate, turning the pavements to dark mirrors. The houses there have a way of pretending to be modest while quietly measuring the worth of those who pass. Eleanor Collingwood's was among them, the garden small, the gate reluctant to open. She greeted us without surprise, as though she had already rehearsed the moment. Her face was composed in that peculiar Oxford way intellect worn thin over disappointment. I introduced Lewis, who remained respectfully silent, dripping on the mat. She gestured us toward the sitting room, where the scent of burnt paper lingered beneath the fragrance of furniture polish. The fire had been lit, though the day was mild. She sat not across from me, but beside the window, her profile illuminated by the weak light. She said her husband had been unwell for years, that the heart had finally claimed him. Her voice was steady, each sentence weighted like a stone dropped into a still pond. Yet something in the rhythm of her speech was too precise, too rehearsed. People who grieve rarely edit themselves. Lewis asked about their marriage practical questions, kindly phrased. She replied that they had lived mostly apart, that she had her charities, her friends, her silence. Her husband, she added, had grown distant long before his death, though she had stopped asking why. I told her we'd found traces of digitalis in his system. She didn't flinch, but her hand, resting on the arm of the chair, closed slightly enough for me to notice the half-moon impression of her ring pressing into her skin. There was a decanter on the sideboard, 2 glasses arranged with ceremonial neatness. One still bore a faint trace of red at the rim. I asked whether her husband had been drinking that evening. She said she couldn't say that she hadn't seen him that night, though she knew his habits well enough to imagine it. I wondered how well one could imagine another person's vices when one had stopped caring about them. Lewis, ever gentle, inquired about visitors, colleagues, students, and friends. She hesitated before naming one Charlotte Dane, a student of classics, bright, admired, too often mentioned. Her husband, she said, had become her mentor. The word carried a quiet bitterness. She asked whether Miss Dane was suspected of something. I said we were merely trying to understand. She smiled faintly and said that understanding was overrated. While Lewis noted her statement, my eyes wandered to the hearth. A thin dusting of ash on the grate, lighter than it should have been. Not wood paper. The fragments nearest the edge still bore traces of ink, a margin perhaps, or a signature line. I asked when she'd last used the fire. She said this morning. For what? I didn't ask. the air already knew. Before we left, she offered coffee, which I declined. My hangover had retreated but not surrendered. As we stood to go, she said, almost absently, that her husband had once told her October was a cruel month. She smiled again, this time without warmth. I told her that was Eliot, not Collingwood. She replied that he'd never been good at distinguishing his own words from other people's. Outside, the rain had softened to drizzle. Lewis asked whether I thought she was lying. I said that she was telling the truth, but perhaps not all of it. He frowned, unused to distinctions so slight. I told him the difference between a lie and an omission was the same as between silence and music, both depending on what you expect to hear. Back in the car, I unfolded the note we'd taken from Collingwood's study. Michaelmas begins again. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him I wasn't sure yet, though it sounded less like a calendar remark than a promise deferred. The phrase carried the melancholy of repetition, something ending so it could begin again. As we passed the turning toward Banbury Road, I noticed a florist closing her shop, sweeping fallen petals from the doorway. A small gesture, futile but persistent. I thought of Eleanor in that too-quiet house, burning pages she could not bear to reread. When we reached the station, I told Lewis to have the forensic team collect the remains from the grate. He looked puzzled and said it was probably just old correspondence. I told him that ashes lie better than people do. Later, as I walked home through Jericho, the air thick with damp and the smell of chimney smoke, I found myself wondering whether the real tragedy in marriages wasn't infidelity or deceit, but the slow erosion of curiosity. When two people stop wanting to know each other, what remains but the ashes of their own courtesy? That night, unable to sleep, I poured myself a small whiskey and wrote a single line in my notebook. A heart can stop in many ways. I closed it then, leaving the rest of the page blank for whatever silence might wish to say next. Charlotte Dane lived in the upper rooms of a college annex, the sort of modern addition Oxford builds to disguise its age, yet never quite convinces anyone of its youth. The porter had described her as self-possessed, which is the adjective people use when they mean dangerous to underestimate. Lewis waited by the car, claiming he disliked the sound of student corridors, though I knew he simply disliked what they reminded him of the years when belief came easily. I told him I'd manage alone. The stairs smelled faintly of cigarettes and ambition. She opened the door before I knocked twice. Her expression was the practiced neutrality of the clever politeness concealing curiosity. She knew why I had come. Inside, the air carried the warmth of tea recently poured and the faint trace of something floral, possibly guilt disguised as perfume. Books were stacked in fragile towers along the wall. Virgil, Catullus, several volumes of modern poetry whose titles spoke of exile and return. She said she was sorry about Dr. Collingwood, her voice level. Her eyes trained not on me but on a point somewhere near my shoulder, as though grief required a fixed horizon. I told her I was sorry too, though perhaps not for the same reason. She gestured toward a chair, and I sat. She talked about her work, Roman elegy, translation, the difficulty of keeping sentiment from spilling into syntax. Her words were well chosen, like someone auditioning for discretion. I asked how well she had known him. She paused long enough to suggest she was deciding which truth would sound least incriminating. She said he'd been her supervisor, her mentor, a friend, perhaps too much of one. Then she looked down, as if embarrassed by the word friend. The photograph on the mantel caught my attention at a departmental dinner, the familiar chaos of forced celebration. Collingwood at the center, smiling too carefully, his hand resting near her shoulder but not quite on it. Behind them, a blurred figure I recognized as Dr. Latham, the historian who had already made himself known to us, by rumor if not by fact. I asked about the photograph. She said it was taken last spring, the night of her dissertation proposal. Her tone suggested she wished the picture had never existed. A slip of paper lay between two books on her desk. I could see part of a phrase, non omnis moria. I read it silently. I shall not wholly die. Horace again. I asked if she was translating it. She smiled, a small, controlled movement that seemed to cost her something. She said it was her reminder that words outlast those who write them. Then she added softly that Collingwood used to quote it to her, though she never understood why. Her tea had gone cold. She stirred it anyway, out of habit. I asked where she'd been the evening of his death. She said she'd been here, revising, no visitors, no calls. The porter could confirm it, she said. I told her, porters confirm many things, that's their profession. She looked at me for the first time then, directly, and I saw in her gaze not fear, but fatigue. She said, quietly, that she hadn't loved him. Not anymore. As I left, she followed me to the landing. She asked whether the college would hold a memorial. I said I imagined it would. She said she might not attend. I asked whether she believed him happy in his last days. She said he'd been talking about Rome again, a fellowship there, a chance to begin anew. Then she smiled, the brittle kind people wear, when a memory cuts through their armor, and said, beginnings are overrated. Outside, the rain had lifted, leaving the street washed and shining. Lewis looked up from his notebook and asked, anything? I told him she'd read Horace with more understanding than honesty. He frowned, uncertain whether I was complimenting her or accusing her. I wasn't certain either. Back at the station, I unfolded my crossword, the one from that morning. The clue I'd struggled with now seemed almost insolent. Immortal in verse. Mortal indeed 5. I wrote in Horace. The answer fits, though imperfectly. Later that night I found myself thinking about her phrase, words outlast those who write them. True enough. But sometimes, I thought, they also betray them. It arrived folded twice and sealed without ceremony, the kind of envelope that pretends to be nothing at all, which of course makes it everything. The handwriting was neither elegant nor crude, a careful disguise of someone who knew the danger of being known. Lewis brought it in from the Morning Post, his expression carrying that faint expectancy that letters addressed to me rarely bring anything cheerful. He said it had come through internal mail. No return address, no initials. I turned it over, studied the creases. Whoever wrote it had folded it with precision, once lengthwise, once across, as if they'd been taught geometry before guilt. The paper itself smelled faintly of tobacco, and something medicinal, like the air in old libraries. The ink was blue, the kind that bleeds slightly when pressed too hard. The message was brief. He didn't die of the heart. He died of heartbreak, hers or mine, you decide. I read it twice before handing it to Lewis. He frowned, said it sounded like something from a poetry competition. I said it was worse than that. It sounded personal. He asked whether it might be a prank. I said Oxford doesn't prank. It confesses in riddles. The postmark was local to the central sorting office. Nothing to narrow it. I asked him to have the handwriting compared to college records, staff files, anything. He nodded, though we both knew the trail would lead to another corridor of dead ends. Later that morning, we drove to St. Jude's. The porter was waiting for us as though our visit had been predicted. He said there had been talk that Collingwood's death wasn't natural. He'd overheard the fellows at dinner, voices lowered but not low enough. The college, he whispered, didn't want scandal so soon after the last one. I asked what scandal, and he said a student affair, but the names had been wiped from record. Oxford excels at forgetting. Lewis spoke to the bursar while I walked through the quad, thinking about the letter's final phrase, hers or mine. It implied two hearts, two versions of loss, one perhaps still alive. A woman's hand would have left smaller loops, a lighter touch that was firmer. a deliberate script. A man's, then, though the sentiment suggested otherwise. At the lodge, a bundle of college mail sat awaiting distribution. I flipped through it, pretending idle curiosity. One envelope bore the same shade of blue ink, the same slight slant. Addressed to Dr. Peter Latham. I slipped it back quietly and told Lewis we'd pay the historian a visit after lunch. Latham received us with the strained civility of a man guarding something that mattered more than comfort. His room was all books and bitterness shelves that sagged under the weight of self-regard. He said he'd admired Collingwood, that they had their differences but shared a love for the ancients. He offered sherry, which I declined. He asked whether we suspected foul play. I told him suspicion was simply curiosity with better manners. He smiled thinly and said he'd heard whispers about Charlotte Dane, that Collingwood had taken a dangerous interest in her work. Jealousy, of course, masquerades easily as concern. As he spoke, I noticed his hand resting on a sheaf of student essays. One bore the faint impression of writing that had bled through from another page. I tilted my head. The phrase was just visible in reverse. The exile's heart is its own goal. Latham caught my glance, moved the papers aside too quickly. His cuff bore a smear of blue ink. I said nothing. Outside, the afternoon had dimmed, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Lewis asked whether I thought Latham had written the letter. I told him no, at least, not that one. His vanity would never permit such anonymity, but he'd written something, I was sure of that. Back at the office, I laid the letter beside Collingwood's lecture notes. The handwriting was different, yet something in the phrasing of the rhythm, the half-poetic construction, echoed the notes themselves. I turned one page and found a line underlined twice. In every act of love there is an unspoken cruelty. I felt the old, familiar unease, the one that arrives when grief begins to rhyme with guilt. Lewis asked whether we'd respond to the letter. I told him we already had, by reading it. He said he didn't follow. I said most confessions aren't meant to be answered, only understood. That evening I walked home through the drizzle, the letter folded once more in my pocket. At the corner by the Randolph, a street musician was playing a slow, uncertain tune on the violin. It faltered halfway, as though memory had betrayed him. When I reached my door, I took the letter out again, unfolded it carefully under the porch light. The ink had begun to blur the edges, as if the rain had finally found its way in. I read the line one. Last time, he didn't die of the heart. It occurred to me then that heartbreak and poison may differ only in speed. It was raining again, though less like weather than memory, thin, steady, unresigned. I walked through the gates of St. Jude's after hours, past the porter's lodge where the lamp still burned. He nodded but did not ask why I'd come. Oxford learns, sooner or later, that certain curiosities are best left implied. The late Dr. Collingwood's study had been cleared. Dust sheets over the chairs, shelves half empty, the scent of wax polish too fresh, as though guilt itself had wiped the place clean. Yet the air still held his ghost, the faint sweetness of old tobacco, the dry ache of paper. I unwrapped the folder Lewis had fetched from evidence of the last of Collingwood's notes for his lecture on Ovid's Tristia. Exile, remorse, the long echo of regret, subjects well suited to this city of unfinished sentences. The pages were uneven, some typed, some handwritten, as if the lecture had resisted coherence. On the final sheet, the words broke mid-line. In the end, every banishment is self and nothing more. I stared at the dash for a long while. The typewriter ribbon had been nearly exhausted, the letters faint, as though the machine itself had begun to tire of repetition. Lewis, had he been there, would have told me to go home. Instead, I lit a cigarette and let the smoke write its own punctuation across the lamplight. There was a note in the margin, small, deliberate, "See the library" inscription. The phrase could have referred to anything. a footnote, an inside joke, a direction meant only for himself. Still, I felt its quiet insistence. Collingwood had been a man who lived by references. Even his secrets, it seemed, preferred citation. The college librarian was a pale woman with a memory that seemed to file itself alphabetically. She told me that Collingwood had borrowed a 19th-century edition of Horace the week before his death, an uncommon copy with an inscription few bothered to notice. He hadn't returned it. I asked whether the book had been found among his belongings. It had not. She suggested, with a touch of irony, that perhaps she had decided to stay in Rome. I left before closing time, carrying the echo of her remark. Rain had begun to collect in the gutters, reflecting the windows like rows of watchful eyes. I crossed to the main library, the Bodleian, that grand reliquary of other people's certainties. Inside, the silence was cathedral. Even the dust moved reverently. I found the volume easily enough, tucked behind a row of theological works, the sort of displacement that never happens by accident. The binding was cracked, the paper smelling faintly of foxing and old sunlight. On the flyleaf, an inscription in brown ink to C.D. Remember that exile is not the end. C.D. Charlotte Dane. The neatness of it almost offended me. Scholars are rarely so sentimental. Yet the hand was unmistakably Collingwood's the same. Tidy precision, the same restraint. I turned the page and a folded photograph slipped free. It showed Collingwood and Charlotte on the steps of St. Jude's Chapel, the light of early spring across their faces. Behind them, half in shadow, stood Latham, blurred, watching. That small coincidence of composition unsettled me more than I cared to admit. The lens sees what the living choose to ignore. I replaced the photograph, though not quite where I'd found it. There are moments in police work rare, unrecorded, when one stops being an investigator and becomes an intruder. That threshold had always tempted me. On my way out, I paused by the reference desk. A student was bent over a dictionary of Latin verse, her fingers tracing the lines as if summoning them into sense. The sight stirred something almost nostalgic, the pure, futile faith of study. It reminded me that Collingwood's life had been built upon the same devotion to translate the irretrievable into meaning and to fail gracefully in the attempt. Outside, the rain had hardened into sleet. Lewis was waiting by the car, coat collar up, his patience steaming faintly in the cold. He asked whether I'd found anything. I said only what he'd left behind. Lewis muttered that the dead always leave too much. As we drove, the wipers beat their slow rhythm. I opened the folder again. There, in Collingwood's final notes, was a line I hadn't noticed before a citation to Horace, Odes II. Exile's wine tastes of memory. I couldn't recall the line existing. Scholars, like detectives, sometimes invent sources to disguise the truth. At a stoplight, Lewis asked what I was thinking. I told him that exile might not have meant geography at all. He said, "From what?" I said, "From forgiveness." He gave me a look that asked for translation, but I had none. That night I sat by my window with a single glass of whiskey and the sound of rain against the panes. I took out the lecture pages once more, tracing that unfinished sentence with my thumb. Every banishment is self. The rest, I thought, had already been lived. There is a certain hour in Oxford between the last seminar and the lighting of lamps when everything seems briefly suspended. The streets grow empty, yet the windows glow with the residual light of those still clinging to reason. I've always thought that dusk suits the university best. Its truths, like its sins, prefer the half-light. I returned to the Bodleian that evening, the rain spent, but the air still trembling with its memory. The porter recognized me, nodded, said nothing. People here rarely do after dark. The old wooden doors sighed as I pushed them open, and a gust of cold air followed me in, bringing with it the faint scent of wet leaves and something older dust, parchment, and a kind of sanctified neglect. The main hall was near deserted. 2 students whispered over a pile of books in the corner, their conspiratorial laughter subdued by the high ceiling. Somewhere, a clock struck 6, the sound muffled as though aware of its own intrusion. I moved toward the Latin section, where the shelf labels leaned slightly, as if time itself had grown weary of precision. It didn't take long to find the book I was searching for, the Horace I'd seen referenced in Collingwood's notes. It had no business being where I found it, tucked behind a row of theology texts, its spine hidden as though ashamed of survival. The leather was cracked, the pages soft from years of handling. I turned it open, and there, between the leaves, something slid free and fell to the floor. A photograph. I picked it up carefully. Collingwood and Charlotte Dane stood on the chapel steps, the light a pale echo of early spring. She looked toward the camera with the poise of someone who knows her image is being taken. He did not, his gaze drifting just beyond her, to something or someone unseen. Behind them, blurred but unmistakable, was Peter Latham. Watching. The presence of the watcher is always what makes a picture real. I turned back to the title page and saw the inscription I'd been told about. To CD. Remember that exile is not the end. The words were written in ink, long faded to the color of regret. There was no signature, but there didn't need to be one. His handwriting was as familiar to me now as the case itself. Lewis would have asked whether the inscription proved affection, possession, or guilt. But affection, possession, guilt are merely variations of the same confession. What mattered was not what he'd written, but that he had chosen to hide it here, where scholarship might one day bury sentiment. As I read, a line from Tristia came to me. I live on in memory, though banished from the city I loved. Perhaps that had been Collingwood's real study of the endurance of loss. The librarian approached quietly, her shoes soft on the stone floor. She asked if I was looking for something in particular. I told her I wasn't sure yet. She smiled, the knowing smile of one who has watched countless men seek meaning in other men's margins. When she turned to leave, I noticed a faint smudge of ink on her wrist. I wondered if she had handled the same book earlier, or if Collingwood himself had passed it to her once, unknowing of the irony he was writing into his own life. The lamps flickered on, one by one, casting long bars of amber across the tables. The sound of rain returned, this time only in imagination. I replaced the book, but kept the photograph. The dead rarely object to theft. Before leaving, I looked once more across the reading room. The 2 students were gone. The light had settled into a quiet melancholy that made everything, even the dust, seem deliberate. Outside, the quadrangle was flooded with the pale residue of twilight. Lewis was waiting by the car, smoking, his breath ghosting in the chill. He asked if I'd found anything. I told him I'd found what I wasn't yet ready to understand. He looked puzzled, but that was Lewis's way of patient incomprehension as a form of faith. On the drive back, I couldn't stop thinking of that photograph. The blurred figure of Latham behind them, the way Collingwood's hand seemed almost to reach for Charlotte's shoulder, but didn't. Desire and restraint caught in a fraction of light are as good a definition of tragedy as any. Later, at home, I poured myself a small whiskey and took the photograph from my coat pocket. The edges were slightly torn, the image already fading. I placed it beneath my lamp and studied it again. The inscription echoed in my mind. Exile is not the end. Perhaps not, but it was close enough. It was Eleanor Collingwood who asked for me that morning. Her message came through the station switchboard, handwritten by the clerk with an impatience I could almost hear. She wished to speak privately about her husband. I told Lewis to drive, though neither of us expected confession. Oxford's widows prefer elegance to absolution. The house looked smaller in daylight, the curtains drawn back as if to feign openness. She met us at the door without her usual formality, a cardigan thrown loosely about her shoulders, her face unadorned. There was an air of decision about her, as though something fragile had been rehearsed and might finally be said. She asked Lewis to wait in the car. The way she said it left no room for discussion. I followed her into the sitting room, where the fire had burned itself to ash. The faint scent of smoke lingered, something consumed but not entirely gone. She said she had thought about our last conversation, about the way I had looked at the hearth, the decanter, the half-filled glass. She had not been able to sleep since. Guilt, I wondered, or the absence of it. She began to speak quietly, as if narrating someone else's tragedy. Her husband, she said, had been planning to leave Oxford. He'd been offered a post in Rome. Research, translation, something to do with exile. He had not told her directly, but she had found the letter on his desk. I asked when she had discovered it. She said the night before he died. Her hands were still as she spoke, resting neatly on her lap, but the knuckles were pale, drained of color. She said she had confronted him not angrily, just with the inevitability of someone who has already been abandoned. He had tried to explain, to soften the decision with words about freedom and new beginnings. She said she'd stopped listening when he mentioned her name, Charlotte Dane. The way she pronounced it, without emphasis, carried more contempt than shouting ever could. She said he had assured her it was over, that he had been foolish, that Rome was not an escape but a correction. But he had still packed the letter into his briefcase, the ink not yet dry. I asked whether she had told anyone. She shook her head. No one. Not even him, she said, though the distinction was unnecessary. I asked what she meant by that. She hesitated, then said she had burned some of his papers to spare him posthumous embarrassment, she called it. She looked toward the fireplace, its great cold, and added that perhaps she'd spared herself more than him. There was a silence after that, the kind that lengthens until it acquires shape. I poured her a small measure of whiskey from the decanter. She did not touch it. Her eyes followed the movement of the glass, as if it carried a history of its own. When she finally spoke again, her voice was almost steady. She said she had not killed him, if that was what I believed. I told her belief was too indulgent a word for my profession. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that appears only to retreat. He was already dying, she said. Of arrogance, of disappointment, of the realization that he was no longer admired. All I did was help him finish a sentence he had begun himself. I asked whether that was a confession. She said it wasn't. I asked whether she wished it were. She looked past me, to the window where the rain had begun again, and said that perhaps confessions were only another way of asking to be remembered. Lewis came in as I was leaving, his expression uncertain, holding the notebook he hadn't used. She offered him tea, which he declined. Outside, he asked whether she had said anything useful. I told him that it depended on one's definition of use. He frowned and said she seemed fragile. I told him that fragility is sometimes the best disguise for resolve. We drove in silence until we reached the junction. I opened my crossword, a habit, a distraction, and glanced at the unfinished clue from the previous day, faithless act disguised as mercy 10. I filled in forgiveness before I realized the irony. Back at my flat, I sat for a long time without turning on the light. The evening grew dim, the sound of traffic softened to a hum. I thought about Eleanor's face in the half-light of her sitting room, not guilt, not relief, but the quiet certainty of someone who has stopped expecting justice. In the corner of my notebook, I wrote a single line. A confession only matters when it's meant for the wrong listener. I closed it after that, though sleep, when it came, felt less like rest than punctuation. Lewis was the first to call it solved. He had that tone of modest relief policemen adopt when a story fits neatly enough to close the file. We'd brought Dr. Peter Latham into the station that morning, not as a suspect, not yet, but as a man whose pride had finally exhausted its own discretion. He looked better than he had the last time we met, freshly shaved, the faint scent of expensive soap, a self-respect freshly ironed. His confession, when it came, was not confession at all, but narrative, and like all good narratives, it sought applause. He said Collingwood had been a proud man, weakened by drink, humiliated by scandal. He said the anonymous letter was his own doing, intended not to deceive, but to defend. Charlotte Dane, he claimed, had begged him to protect her from insinuation, to spare her from the gossip of dons and dinner tables. Collingwood's death, he insisted, was an accident. The man had been unwell, dependent on pills, and fond of the bottle. The rest of the letter, the implication, had been theatre. Lewis found the explanation soothing. People like tidy endings. They keep the corridors quiet. I listened, not to what Latham said, but to how he said it, the careful rhythm of an academic who has lectured himself into believing his own version of grace. When he left, Lewis looked at me with something close to hope. He asked whether we should call it done. I told him the truth, never requiring punctuation. He said I'd grown cynical. I said cynicism was merely the shape reason takes after disappointment. Back in my office, I unfolded the crossword from that morning's Times. A half-finished clue stared up at me. Plant that breaks the heart 9. I had left it blank, though the answer arrived now with unsettling clarity. Foxglove. I wrote it in, slowly, the pen hesitating over the last letter. Digitalis. The poison of poets and gardeners. I thought of Eleanor Collingwood's conservatory, the row of foxgloves by the window, their purple bells hanging like penitents in prayer. She'd offered me tea that afternoon, her hands trembling not from grief, but from the effort of restraint. When I'd asked about the garden, she'd said it kept her company. The remark had struck me as both true and rehearsed. Lewis came in with 2 cups of tea, his habit when the room grew too quiet. He asked what I was thinking. I told him nothing that would make sense yet. He said he was glad Latham had come clean, and guilt eats people alive. I said not everyone who looks hungry is starving. He frowned, unsure, and asked if I'd ever consider letting a guilty man go. I said sometimes it's the innocent who insist on staying. When he left, I took the letter from my desk drawer, the one that had started this spiral of interpretation. The ink had faded slightly, the paper grown soft from handling. He didn't die of the heart. He died of heartbreak, hers or mine. You decide. The phrase has always troubled me. Hers or mine. Not his. Whoever wrote it had not loved the dead man enough to claim the grief. The possessive absence was telling. Evening came without warning, the kind of dusk that erases the boundary between thought and regret. I poured a small measure of whiskey, the first of the day, and let the silence gather. Cases rarely end with revelation. They expire from exhaustion. The mind, like the heart, can be persuaded to rest before it is ready. But there was one detail that refused to sleep. In Collingwood's lecture notes on the unfinished ones on Ovid's Tristia, a line had been underlined twice. Love itself can be the cause of exile. The handwriting was his, but the ink was too fresh, too deliberate. It was not an annotation of understanding, but of warning. Perhaps he had known. Perhaps the exile had begun long before the heart stopped. Later, I walked home through the drizzle, the lamps casting their tired halos over the pavements. I passed a florist locking up, the buckets of wilting blooms lined along the curb. Among them, a few sprigs of foxglove are unsold, unchosen. I paused, staring at their color deepened by the rain. Beautiful things, I thought, are rarely harmless. When I reached my flat, I sat by the window, the crossword open beside me. Lewis's voice still echoed faintly, calling it done. But closure, in my experience, is just another word for blindness. I closed my eyes and saw Eleanor again, her stillness, her composure, the faint smudge of soil on her sleeve. I wondered, not for the first time, whether her confession had already been made not in words, but in the simple care of those poisonous flowers by her window. Outside, a bell began to toll the hour. Its echo drifted across the city like a verdict delayed. I thought of Collingwood's last note, that dash where the sentence broke. Some endings, I realized, are never written, they are simply understood too late. The morning I returned to the Collingwood house, the city was still in half-light, that peculiar Oxford hour when mist blurs the distinction between stone and memory. The air held a damp, metallic quiet. Leaves clung to the pavement like pages someone had tried and failed to discard. I remember thinking that the weather was indecently calm for what I knew I was about to hear. Eleanor met me in the conservatory. The glass roof, beaded with rain, diffused the light so that she appeared at once luminous and diminished a woman fading beautifully. She was tending to the plants, her fingers dusted with soil, her movements precise, deliberate. In the corner, the foxgloves hung heavy, their bells almost too vivid against the dull grays of the morning. She said she had known I would come. I asked why. Because, she said, men like you prefer the truth to the law. I told her I didn't, not anymore. She smiled faintly, as if to forgive me for the lie. She poured coffee into delicate china cups, her hand steady, her eyes never leaving mine. She said she had thought about her husband every day since his death. Not with grief, not exactly, but with a kind of unrelenting presence. It is difficult, she said, to mourn someone whose voice still echoes in your head like unfinished conversation. I asked whether she had loved him. She said once, intensely later, habitually. Then not at all, and yet she said, love does not vanish. It curdles, becomes pity, resentment, sometimes even duty. She lifted the cup but didn't drink. I noticed her wedding ring still in place, though it seemed looser now, as if her hand had learned to live without it. I asked her about Rome, about the position her husband had accepted. She said he would never have gone, even if he'd lived. The post had been a fantasy, a kind of punishment he invented for himself. She told me she had read the letter he left behind, the one he'd never posted. It wasn't to Charlotte. It was to her. She reached into a drawer and handed me the envelope, already open. The letter was brief, written in his precise academic hand. Forgive me for the exile I have made of us both. The heart's geography is smaller than Rome. I folded it and placed it back on the table. I asked whether she had forgiven him. She said forgiveness was too clean a word for what remained. Then, quietly, she said he had come to her that night. They had sat by the fire, as they had done for years, speaking of nothing, avoiding everything. When he poured the wine, his hands trembled. She had steadied the glass for him, and then she watched him drink. There was no accusation in her voice, only weariness, the calm of one who has already endured the sentence. She said he had spoken of release, of wanting the noise in his mind to stop. She had listened and said nothing, as she had always done. When he smiled at her, she knew it was the last time he would. I looked at the foxgloves. She followed my gaze. You see, she said, I did not stop him. I only failed to save him. And that, she added, is its own kind of murder. I didn't answer. The rain had begun again, soft at first, then insistent. The sound filled the space between us. She asked whether I would tell anyone. I said I didn't know. She said it didn't matter, that guilt was a private arrangement. When I left, the air smelled faintly of damp earth and iron. Lewis was waiting by the car, his face lined with the question he didn't want to ask. I told him only that it was over. He nodded, relieved, and said he'd file the paperwork. I told him not to hurry. As we drove away, I looked back once. Through the rain-blurred glass, I could see her in the conservatory, tending to her plants, the foxgloves swaying gently as she brushed past. There was something unbearably human in the gesture, the small persistence of care after everything else had been spent. Later that night, alone in my flat, I poured a whiskey and turned to the crossword. The final clue stared up at me. End of faith, beginning of peace. 5. I wrote in my sleep, though I suspected the answer was wrong. Outside, the bells of All Saints began to toll for evensong, their sound drifting across the rooftops like a requiem for the living. I thought of Eleanor's hands in the soil, of Collingwood's unfinished sentence, of the quiet mercy that sometimes wears the mask of sin. Michaelmas had come again, as it always does. The city breathed, and somewhere, unseen, the river carried the light away.